Hello lovely humans, welcome to this space on the internet. Simon vs. the Homosapiens Agenda, or often better known by its film title Love, Simon, was a groundbreaking book in my life as a young queer person, as it was for many young queer people alike. And one of the reasons that this book has had such a large impact is because of its film adaptation. To illustrate, I saw the film before I read the book at a local movie theater, because queer community organizers were paying for any young person's entry to see the movie. This was when I was in middle school, when the film obviously had first come out. I went with a few friends to the theater and I thought it was great, except for I probably thought it was a little more great than my peers at the time did, and was probably more personally impacted and touched by the storyline than I could have put my finger on at the time, but here we are now. Fast forward a year, and I've unknowingly befriended a more queer peer circle, and this book was suddenly at my disposition. And I fell in love with this book, and it should be of note that I didn't really associate it with the film adaptation because they were so vastly different. Which brings me to the subject of this video. In this video, I want to talk about the movie adaptation and the original novel, Simon vs. the Homosapiens Agenda, and some of the differences between them, especially in the ways in which they convey the young queer experience. In particular, I want to highlight the contrast between the intended audiences, as well as kind of the source of storytelling, as in coming from Becky Albertalli, the author, versus a screenwriter's adaptation, and just the ways in which connected storylines differ and why. And just some things that I find interesting about this particular movie and book. So let's talk about the book. For context, I believe the book came out in 2015. To the best of my knowledge, Simon vs. the Homosapiens Agenda was Becky Albertalli's first kind of breakthrough novel. It's an accessible story, my copy only spanning about 300 pages, with short chapters and plenty of spacing. It's written in the first person through the main character or protagonist, Simon Spear, or Spire. It's not really clear because at some points they say it rhymes with queer, like spear, but also they define it in the book as like spire, meaning to look. So I'm unclear as to whether it's spear or spire, but Simon. And the book details the developing online relationship between Simon and a fellow student under the pseudonym Blue, as well as Simon's personal life, as in his friendship circle, his family, his involvement with the fine arts, and tackling his own internal world and character development, and eventually how the two converge. By contrast, the movie Love, Simon came out in 2018 and details the life of Simon Spear/Spire, being a closeted gay high schooler. And yeah, that's kind of how it goes. And it's basically Simon navigating some of the ups and downs of being a senior in high school and also being gay and not knowing how that looks for him. In my opinion, it's a rather cliché story that was altered in minor ways to have some appeal to a queer audience, unlike a lot of movies we've had in the past. In fact, I'm not sure for what exact reason this film was supposed to be groundbreaking in the realm of providing queer representation, because there's there's more than one queer character, but one queer character that we know more than their name and how they look. And it's also of note that this queer character is a gay, presumably allosexual, white, cis dude. But I think in lieu of the legacy that the book left, the movie was quite a phenomenon. In having rewatched the movie and reread the book recently, I just want to talk about and analyze a few of the differences that I saw and why they kind of annoyed me a little bit, or why I thought they were interesting choices, and so on. These are in no particular order, it's just going to be a spew of my thoughts. I'll try and timestamp them if there's things you find particularly interesting, but we'll see how it goes. First thing, erasing disability in the movie. In the film, they depict a lot of Simon's past in like brief little montages, and one in particular that struck me was his awkward middle school phase as they portray it, and he's wearing glasses. And if you've read the book, you'll know that Simon does wear glasses all the time and expresses distinct dismay at the idea of wearing contacts. So I thought it was a bit of a strange choice that was not particularly like important, but could have been more accurate to the book and slightly less weird to me. Like, it's weird to me that in his awkward youth he wore glasses, and then suddenly as this teenager later in high school he no longer wears glasses, but they don't hint at the fact that he wears contacts or anything. It's just suddenly he no longer wears glasses. I don't know, that was just a small thing that kind of miffed me a little bit. Kind of as if portraying him with glasses was like somehow hinting at his character when really it isn't. That's just based on strange stereotypes around nerds and glasses and whatnot. The next difference I want to note was the timeline of the emails. So in the movie I found that the way in which they portrayed and the time they spent focused on the correspondence between Blue and Simon was quite rushed and not very personal, which made me as a viewer struggle to understand the relationship that Simon and Blue had developed and established online. As opposed to in the book, we read the email correspondence. It's its whole own, like, there's chapters interspersed throughout the book that are the emails and they're time-stamped. So you can really see it develop over time in tandem with Simon's real life, and you can see how they start to infiltrate each other. The way it's portrayed in the book, we can, as an audience, directly derive the intricacies of this relationship from the way they write, the frequency in which they write, and I think it much more closely, accurately depicts the young queer experience growing up with the internet and finding online refuge and friendship. This is a pretty broad one, but the differences in character development with all of the characters, just with all of the characters, is quite different in the movie and the book. Not because they actually take particularly different journeys, just because the book had a much more meaningful arc and the characters in general were just much more interesting and distinct. In particular, when we're talking about Simon, Simon is rather one-dimensional, seemingly to me, in order to appeal to a broader audience, in particular a cishet audience. He's conventionally attractive, he's rather uncreative, there's nothing really notable. He looks like young male protagonist to me. Whereas within the book, and this is something you'll see with any movie versus book adaptation, it just is handled better or worse depending on what exactly you're examining. Having access to Simon's internal monologue far better develops Simon's character, and his actions in the novel better depict the intricacies of his character. Because Simon's really funny, and while he's like mildly depicted to be a jokester in the movie, it's like rather non-committal and not actually that funny. It kind of felt like we were supposed to laugh at him rather than with him in the movie, but maybe that was just me. But Simon has a very distinct voice, and that's even pointed out in, I guess, spoiler, the book, where Blue comments that he figured out Simon's identity because of the way he wrote. It's quite similar to the way he speaks. And we didn't get that in the movie. I wish they'd pulled more lines directly or had a more present kind of monologue from Simon voicing over some situations, because I really missed the kind of quirky character that Simon was. Next, let's talk a little bit about the character Leah and how her character corresponds with some fatphobia. In the movie adaptation, Leah is thin, conventionally attractive, also in love with Simon. I don't know where that came from. She doesn't really have any hobbies, so to speak, whereas book Leah was a very distinct character. She was curvy, emo, later detailed to be bisexual, though not in this book. She was an artist. She did drawings and liked anime and stuff. She was drama prone and subversive. And it was hard to get to like her, which was actually kind of important to the whole plot and Simon's interpersonal relationships. And she was a lot more interesting and a lot more reflective of a lot of young queer, particularly emo bisexual girls. And they just had to make her thin and conventionally attractive, which just doesn't make sense. Why did they have to do that? Because main characters can't be fat. That's just, without being a comedic, like, side character that just, like, pops in to be funny because they're fat. Like, you can't have fat characters. Joking, obviously, because you should have fat characters. They're so interesting. Not because they're fat, just that being part of their identity as a human person is just part of what makes them interesting, among many other things. In terms of fatphobia, the movie also uses fat as an insult to, like, show the less desirable path of life, like, oh, you don't want to grow up and be a fat old man with 4 roommates, which is also like, hello, normative and whatever. But there was no call for that, they didn't need it, and they could have cast a fat actress and depicted Leah better. She just could have been way more interesting. So that was one of the main downfalls for me, I think. Another major downfall of the movie compared to the book for me was the downplaying of theater. So in the movie, Miss Albright, the drama teacher, is continually disappointed at the lack of talent amongst her teenage high school musical cast. Mention of theater is rather scarce, and it's depicted as a high school trope that drama kids are uncool and kind of a joke. Simon, when interacting with theater, is depicted as like awkward and haha funny. Whereas in the book, drama class was a unique escape and kind of a primary location to a lot of plot and character developments. It's depicted neutrally to positively by someone who is actually involved in it, which I think makes a difference. Simon being devoted to his high school musical production. To me, this speaks to another indication that the movie, more so than the book, was geared towards a general audience that detects and upholds tropes like this and isn't actually involved in theater. And let's think about who does theater in high school. Trope-wise, for sure, but theater is often a refuge for queer teenagers. And it is a serious part of their lives, and it doesn't mean they're talentless. To depict them as such is a little bit strange to me. Not that I'm saying that teenage musical productions are the epitome of talent, but I don't see why they can't be. And we're just going to keep digging in deeper here, moving on to talking about intimacy. And whatever you're thinking, stop thinking of it and let me explain. The level of intimacy depicted in the novel versus the film. In the movie, Blue, or spoiler, Bram, kiss once on display for everyone within a mile to see at the top of a Ferris wheel. It was cute to see the general support and all. The novel equivalent of Bram and Simon first being able to meet sans pseudonyms is much more private, mind you, a lot less cinematic perhaps, rendition of their relationship, which still recognizes the risks of being openly gay, and also doesn't put this young teenage queer couple's expression and intimacy on full display, seemingly for the joy and satisfaction of other people. Compared to the book, watching the movie almost makes me feel like the Ferris wheel scene is to please a crowd of non-queer people, rather than just an authentic expression of the central relationship. And I don't mean to like shit on the movie adaptation for this reason of like portraying a grand cinematic moment of queer love, but they're children, and because they're queer it almost like is putting them on a pedestal of sorts in my eyes, and it just didn't feel authentic to me and kind of undermined the idea of self-discovery that was somewhat present within the whole movie, because it was so spurred on by a crowd of outsiders who weren't Simon themselves, experiencing his own character development and making his own choices and coming into his own. And it just didn't really make sense to me. It was weird. On the topic of weird, let's talk about what is seemingly an irrelevant detail that I feel like I need to talk about, is age. In the novel, Simon is 16 years old, I believe. He's a junior in high school. For my Canadians out there, that's grade 11. And in the movie, they choose to make him 17 and in his senior year, which I know, very small difference. But as someone who was not long ago in my last 2 years of high school, you can have a very notable shift between the two. Simon being 16 in the book makes him feel very surrounded by high school. There isn't an out on the horizon. Everything about his high school experience is his reality in that time period through which the book is progressing. High school is where he spends most of his time and energy and defines the situations he finds himself in. And while as a viewer, especially if you're not in high school, there can seem to be something very trivial about watching a high schooler navigate that whole alternate reality that is high school and being so absorbed in it. But there's a reason so many shows choose to make high school their setting, because it's this alternate universe in which high schoolers especially ones who aren't on their way out in grade 12, are thoroughly absorbed. When in the depths of high school, small things feel big, and there's a lot of self-discovery while also still being confined to an ongoing reality that is high school. The focus can shift when you're in grade 12, and there's a different, especially in terms of storytelling, focus in making, for example, Simon in his senior year. There's a shift to thinking more about what you'll do after high school and how you're breaking through those confines of high school that held you before but now seem rather insignificant. Neither of these options, being in grade 11 or grade 12, is a bad option in terms of storytelling or even this particular story necessarily. However, centering someone in their senior year, as they do in the movie, contributes further to the very cinematic approach taken by the filmmakers, in my opinion, with there being hope and change and a sense of a different future awaiting the main characters, namely Simon. But the novel has a very different feel with this regard, which I believe speaks more to kids who are still in school and held within the associated confines of it. In the novel, the character development is more centered internally with no major lifestyle changes occurring on the outside. They're continuing within their same environment, but there's a sense of self-discovery, which was the main focus, in my eyes, of the novel. The focus of the novel is put on Simon's self-realization of his identity, by which I mean his identity as a person, as a student within his high school, within his peer group, within his family, not necessarily his sexuality per se. Anyway, so I think making him 17 going on 18 instead of 16 going on 17 is an interesting choice that they didn't have to make. They had to actively choose to change the age of Simon and his friend group for the movie adaptation. And I think it does more for glorifying the kind of like queer experience, which is interesting, and shifts the movie further, in my opinion, away from the focus of the novel and the target audience of the novel, which, as far as I can tell, seems to be young, school-age queer kids. Overall, in Love, Simon compared to Simon versus the Homosapiens Agenda, I feel like there was a lot left behind that, I mean, I'm not the filmmakers, but I don't think it needed to be left out. That could have made the movie a more accurate replication of the book, although I don't think that's what they were going for necessarily. I think they were going for something with mass appeal. And having targeted kind of a more mass appeal, I think that the movie rings less true for myself and perhaps other queer people who really found themselves in the movie, but also especially in the book. And I think it can feel like a bit of a shame that a lot of what made the novel's storyline and so impactful was what wasn't featured in the movie. So I guess personally I look forward to seeing hopefully more film dedicated to exploring a more authentic queer experience, which also includes more diverse representation, which we are increasingly getting. But also, have you noticed the trend of TV shows, I guess movies too, about teenage cis guys who are figuring out they're gay and kind of the world revolves around them? Because I have, and it seems quite, I almost want to say monotropic, even though that's not what I know that's not what that means. But like, it's the same thing, regurgitated a little bit. And I'm excited to see a more broad exploration of, for example, queer people of color interacting with each other, and less allonormative and metanormative relationship structures, and more ways that people are queer featured on screen, which obviously is underway. I also hope that this kind of media makes its way to the forefront of mass attention, because I think the reason the same tropes are regurgitated is because they're popular and they seem to work in engaging an audience larger than those who it is directly speaking to, so to speak. Which, the vibe I get from the movie Love, Simon is that it also pleased a variety of not queer people, which is great in involving them in kind of our fight and increasing allyship. But it's not a full picture of what allyship or even queer people are or look like. And nothing ever will be. No movie has to be everything, no TV show has to be everything, no book has to be everything. But continuing to create authentic expression, I think, will continue to further an understanding of the queer community in a variety of multifaceted ways. So that's my little analysis of Love, Simon versus the Homosapiens Agenda. Hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts below if you want to. I love hearing them. Also, they help further my video if you comment, which is also cool. As a now university student, the funds that come from ad revenue on YouTube can be a helpful side income. So if you want to support us that way, that's cool beans. And otherwise, we'll see you next time in this space on the internet.